I want to apologize. I have it set up for my podcast, but hopefully nobody saw
it. Oh, that was awesome.
I got to make one for this Leadership Live. I've been putting it off, but no. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Leadership Live with Chris and JJ. And, you know, this is going to be a fun one because we're talking today about accepting responsibility, and I accept responsibility for not turning that intro video off. How you doing today, Chris?
I'm great, JJ. How are you?
Man, that actually scared me. I wasn't expecting that to pop up.
I was not expecting it. I'm like, all right, let's go. Time for a show.
Time for a show. Well, you know, I enjoy that show, but that's the primary use that I have for this platform. But you know, it's great to go on here and do these leadership lives with you, and you know, accepting responsibility. You know, this is part of a 4-part series on dealing with people. So accepting responsibility, you know, ownership is another way of putting that. It's really kind of a main piece that a lot of people get wrong. And it's not because they intentionally want to get it wrong. Honestly, we grow up in our lives kind of selfish, and it's by design. I mean, when we're young as kids, it's all about survival and figuring out who we are, and then we become an adult, and then we get a job where we have to learn our way into that, and so it's all about survival there too. But when it comes to accepting responsibility, I feel like once you become that supervisor or manager, or if you want to consider yourself a leader, you know, accepting everything within your sphere of influence with your employees, everything there on your team, that is your sphere of influence. If you're a CEO, everything within your company is within your sphere of influence. And so when something goes wrong, instead of saying, oh man, that was Joe Snuffy over there that did that, you know, looking at what you as a leader can do differently to affect the change is probably the most important thing. And so I'll let you go ahead and put your spin on it, but I wanted to go ahead and throw that out there first.
No, you're right, JJ. I think this is going to be a really interesting series talking about dealing with people. And, you know, we've got a couple great segments that are going to be part of this, but the responsibility piece, ownership, accountability, that's the baseline. Like that's where we have to start from a foundational level when we're dealing with people, right? Because we have to demonstrate, and again, lead by example, that we understand as leaders in whatever capacity that is, the buck stops with us. So the more that we demonstrate our willingness to own situations, to take that accountability, that trickles down, you know, in the same way that in our last series, we were talking about culture, and, you know, when the leaders in the organization embrace the culture and that's how they act, then other people are going to kind of follow along. Same with accountability. When you are just understanding that everything that happens below me, within my team, within my organization, ultimately rolls up to me, then your people are going to be less likely to let that get all the way up to you. They're going to see that, hey, Chris or JJ, they're willing to step up and say, that was my fault. It happened 2 layers below me in the organization, but ultimately that was my fault. I didn't give the right guidance. I didn't, you know, do these things. This is how I'll do it better. That just filters through an organization, and it creates high performance at the end of the day.
It does, but that culture part of it doesn't happen until you, as the leader, accept responsibility for that first. And by the way, this is a trust issue a lot of times.
Oh yeah,
in an organization. If you're that person that immediately goes to who did it, who's at fault, and instead you could be that person that is going through and saying, well, let's figure this out together. Let's either have a meeting or let's gather around here real quick and just talk about why this thing happened. I want to figure out what I can help you guys with to make this different. If you're not that person, then you're going to have trust issues. Somebody, people on a team or in an organization, they want a leader who will not pass the buck. They want a leader that will accept the responsibility for anything that happens. And you don't accept the responsibility in that, you're going to walk away saying, man, I screwed all this crap up. That's not what we're saying. We're talking about accepting responsibility in that, this is your responsibility to fix. It's your responsibility to make sure this doesn't happen again. And you can't avoid all mistakes, but you need to figure out what you are doing, and what contributes to whatever that situation is. And because we probably need to figure out an example, but whatever that situation is, you have a place within that. And as a leader of the organization, part of that place is figuring out procedurally, training wise, whatever the case may be, how you can inform people better or get people prepared so that particular situation doesn't happen again.
Yeah. One of the things that I want to say about accountability is that when you're at that leadership level and you say, I'm going to accept responsibility for what happens down trace from me, that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences for people downstream. Like, accountability doesn't mean that you're shouldering the burden for everything and that nothing's going to happen. Let's say that there's a flagrant violation, right? I don't know if this has ever happened, in your military experience, JJ, but let's say that you've got a supply tent and it's got a bunch of flammable and combustible things inside. And there's a dude in there smoking a cigarette. Now, and let's say this is just like some private first class, and you could say he doesn't know better, but the labels on the big drums would tell you otherwise if you have half a brain cell. So that dude's going to get in trouble, but I'm going to guess that someone further up the chain is going to get in trouble because that happened. And they may have been on the opposite side of the base, but they're going to get in trouble. They're going to take accountability. But then that dude that was doing it, there's going to be consequences for him too.
Mm-hmm. Well, those leaders should have informed everybody on that team, anybody surrounding that tent, that there are flammable things here. There are no candles. There are no open flames at all, and that includes smoking cigarettes and anything that could potentially have an open flame. And so I know in the military they expect that, but an implied task doesn't necessarily mean it's an obvious task. So you're right. The leader has the responsibility for that in this situation, because if he didn't tell them, then they're not supposed to know. But from higher up, and this is a great example. And yes, this type of thing, maybe not with flammables, but all kinds of stuff in a combat zone or in a field environment or even in an office. But this resonates with me on so many different levels. So this works because now, say one drum had maybe it didn't explode. Maybe there was a small fire on it because somebody was smoking in the tent. It got reported up higher. Somebody's going to talk about it, right? You can't always contain things at the lowest level, which is what you try to do, just because you don't want the drama. Nobody wants the drama. It's not that you're hiding things from the superiors. It's just because you want to handle things at the lowest level for, culture reasons. And in this situation, when the higher ups find out about it, what happens? Say you are the person in charge of that area of operations, that the area of responsibility, whatever the case may be, and they come down and they talk to you. They're going to say, JJ, I heard that somebody was smoking in your tent and one of the barrels caught on fire. What the heck is going on? if so there are two scenarios here. You could either accept responsibility or not. And the way that you wouldn't accept responsibility is that you'll say, man, I told Joe Snuffy not to come in here, but Joe Snuffy came in here. Joe Snuffy lit up that cigarette, and Joe Snuffy caught that doggone barrel on fire. Or let's look at the accepting responsibility scenario. Sir, that's my fault. I believe I briefed everybody, but maybe Joe Snuffy, or not Joe Snuffy, but maybe not all my guys were there. I briefed everybody again, but we're going to have a class on why it's important to not have an open flame near this tent. And I do apologize for that. And then they're probably going to be coming to you saying, well, who did it? Why did it happen? Blah, 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 the whole 9 yards. Sir, all of that will be laid out in my report. But from now on, it's not going to happen again. You don't need to divulge the details because that person is going to get in so much trouble and there's going to be so much drama as a result of it. And it's not that person shouldn't be held accountable for their actions, but if you don't start nothing, there won't be nothing. Accept responsibility for it. Let them know that you're going to, assure them that you're going to take care of it. Do whatever paperwork and reporting that needs to be done as a result of that situation. Let that do all the stuff that you got to do, but accept the responsibility in the moment. Make sure those people move on, and then do what you got to do to correct that within your team or your organization.
So in a situation like that, right, you as the leader, you've accepted responsibility up the chain of command, explain what's not going to happen again, how you're going to address it. But then in a situation like this, would there be any kind of consequence for Joe Snuffy, who's our culprit in this case?
Yes. So let's look at it two ways. Militarily, he would probably front back go until he is exhausted. Okay. And that is exercise and all that stuff. Yes. So there will be a consequence, but in a civilian environment, I would say that there would be a write-up, and that write-up would be passed up to HR. HR would either allow that write-up to take place, or they would have another recommendation for punishment. And, you just kind of have to do whatever it is that needs to be done. If you're in a smaller organization, obviously if it's yours and it's a tiny little organization, handle that as you will. Sometimes a person would get fired. Sometimes a person would just get talked to. Sometimes a person would get written up. There's really no good, bad, right, or wrong to handle it. In a larger organization, it's always going to be a write-up with a recommendation for punishment. And before you administer that write-up to that person, you got to pass it up the chain to make sure that it's got the stamp of approval, because God forbid you as a manager even try to do the wrong thing based off of the policies and procedures that are laid out in that company. But, obviously there has to be some accountability for that person who was doing the wrong thing. I mean, you can't just let him slide, let it slide. There has to be something done. And unfortunately, sometimes that means, especially when there's an open flame involved, that, there has to be an example made of that person so that nobody else does it again.
Yeah. And so this is where there are different levels, right? There's always different levels. So in this case, flagrant violation could have had really significant, negative consequences, right? Mm-hmm. And that's where, the lesson kind of needs to be taught. But then there are times also that as a leader, that something happens, maybe it's small, maybe it's not, doesn't have the potential to create something catastrophic. And the person that did it, they don't necessarily get reprimanded. They don't necessarily get written up. They're talked to. Like you take it on the chin from your boss. Yes, this, I take responsibility for this. This is how I'll prevent it from happening again. And you use it as a learning opportunity for that person that did it. And I'm talking about in a true mistake, like literally didn't know better, couldn't have known better because they weren't having an open flame and a tent full of drums that said like hazardous, right? Like
Yeah.
there could have been no common sense applied in a situation, but there was a mistake. So there are times that it's better for you as the leader to go to that person and not even necessarily talk about the fact that something came down from higher, or even if you catch it and you just like nip it in the bud and you take responsibility.
Yeah, which is always preferred.
Yeah, that the conversation and the teaching of, understanding what happened, why it happened, how we prevent it, but that person not getting in trouble and just using it as a learning lesson. You're building some leadership capital, but you're providing cover for that person, right? Maybe they're brand new, but that carries a lot of weight in the way that they're going to interact with you later on. Like, oh, you know what? JJ had my back on this.
Yep.
And it could have been so much worse, but instead he took the approach of helping me to learn and avoid doing this. And there's not a mark on my record as a result. So like
Yes.
it comes back to trust. We
Yep.
just said a few minutes ago, you said it starts with trust. That's one of the ways that you can build that trust.
It's true. And that's always the preferred way, is that nobody outside of that tent said anything to anybody, and you can turn it into a teaching moment. I would hope that let's say you're a supervisor or a manager that's lower on the rung. You can only control what you can control. Once outside entities start finding out about things, procedurally things start having to happen differently. However, if it's a confined incident where only the people that were involved found out about it, and you can just turn it into a teaching moment, no write up, no heads rolling, no nothing like that, and you can turn that into maybe a training opportunity or maybe a structured conversation to help that person understand why that fire shouldn't have been there, or whatever the case may be. I do think that is the approach that should always be taken. I talked about, when I was given that example, and of course I had in the back of my mind the whole time I was saying that the heads were rolling because the higher ups were already right there. And so unfortunately, there you kind of have a foot on your neck and you almost have to do something about it. But if you don't have that foot on your neck, or maybe you're in an organization that culturally they prefer to have teaching opportunities rather than heads roll, because that's a possibility too. Gosh,
Mhm.
I haven't had a civilian organization that I've been a part of yet that's culturally the way it is. But if I had a larger organization, that's definitely the way it would be. But if it's a combined incident, I agree with you, Chris. 110% a teaching opportunity, especially. And in my opinion, for something like that, let's go to your specific example. I still think that that person should kind of be made an example out of, but not in a negative way. Definitely, when that teaching opportunity comes, it should be a group teaching opportunity. And you got to point out Joe Snuffy and say, because knuckleheads like Joe Snuffy can walk in there with a bunch of drums with a cigarette in his hand and an open flame trying to light it, just letting them know that this isn't just a hypothetical situation. This actually happened, and
Mhm.
knucklehead over here did it, and just because if you don't do that and they're thinking it's hypothetical, they're going to be a lot more relaxed and laissez-faire about it than they would if they know that somebody on that team actually did that, and that there could have been consequences, but there wasn't. And this is what we're going to do differently, and this is why.
Yep. Um, yeah, there's so many different ways to handle it,
Yeah.
but the goal is always to prevent things from happening in the future, right? You always have to learn from things, but from an accepting responsibility standpoint, there are times also that you as a leader, you're working alongside other leaders, right? Maybe you're the team lead for team A and you're part of a specific process. And then there's team B and there's a team lead there. Maybe there's a bottleneck, or maybe you're you as a peer are seeing how team leader from team B is dealing with things. Maybe they're not making their numbers, right? You go through your weekly meetings where you're reviewing metrics with the entire organization. How do you deal with team leader B that's not making their numbers in a way that's not going to make them defensive, but you're clearly holding them accountable for things?
So let me be clear. Team leader B is a peer of mine, or it's somebody that's on my team.
Peer of yours.
Peer of mine. I love this example. So with a peer, my goodness, how you handle this is going to affect every future situation that you have with that peer.
Yep.
And I want to make that 100% clear. And you want it to be the most positive situation that it can be, because that person, depending on how you approach this situation, could turn from struggling and needing help to defensive. And so, first of all, walking up to that person and saying, hey, look, let's break away from everybody for a couple of minutes and let's have a conversation about something. I don't really think it's anybody else's business, but let's have a chat. And once you do that, now you are confined in a space that's a safe spot, right? I'm not saying that, a lot of people don't get into the woo-woo stuff, right? But a safe spot just basically means that you're not putting them on blast in front of all of the other peers, or maybe their team, or maybe some of your higher ups, or whatever the case may be, because nobody likes to be put on blast. Nobody. It ticks them off, makes them feel uncomfortable, makes them feel like they're being attacked, the whole 9 yards. So first of all, start off with that. It's almost treated as almost like a counseling session or a performance review. This situation should start off exactly that way. Then once you're in a safe spot, right, then you talk to that person in a way that you're just letting them know that you're acknowledging that they're having maybe some challenges, and you're offering you're asking permission to offer some perspective. And now if they look at you and the very first thing they say is, nah, man, I just have to deal with this myself, and they're very defensive from the get-go, give them the respect of that space to let them reach out to either you or somebody else, but make that recommendation. I'm always here. I'm not trying to jump in your business or step on your toes. However, if you want to talk about this in the future, I'd be happy to have a chat, or, I do recommend you reach out to somebody. Maybe somebody can help you. But if it's the opposite way, I know I'm turning this into a long thing, but it's very important that you brought this up, but if they're open to it, then you make your recommendations, and they've already given you permission to do that. And it's a safe space for you to do that, because nobody else is there. Nobody knows that you're having the conversation. They just know that you pulled this guy off to the side and you had a chat. And the reason you do that is because you want that person to feel like they're being respected in this situation, because everybody makes mistakes, but they don't always want everybody else to know about it.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, I think that it also comes down to, and I know we're going to have a segment on building relationships.
Yep.
But it's all tied together, right? Trust, accountability, relationships. The stronger one is, the stronger the other two can become.
Yep.
And there's more than just the three that kind of weave in there, but it's also maybe proactively reaching out to that person, right? Let's say it's me and you, and this is long before anything comes up, but me as a leader seeking feedback from you. Hey man, I'm dealing with X over here. This is how I plan on approaching it. What are your thoughts? Have you ever seen something like this? So if you start to build that dialogue with your peers that are in leadership roles, and you're proactively coming to them, and I'm not saying that you do this just to like make a reason to have a conversation, but when you find that you are struggling with something as a leader, this is like the dichotomy of accountability. Yeah, it's on my shoulders and I need to deal with this, but I've also built this network of people that I can go bounce an idea off of to try to come up with maybe a better solution than what I can come up with on my own.
Yeah.
And then when it comes time when, I see that you need a conversation because you're not meeting your numbers on your weekly scorecard and everyone else in the room is seeing it, no one's calling it out. I've built that relationship with you so that we can have that conversation. I'm like, hey, JJ, like what's going on over here? How can I help you? I've noticed that we're kind of running in the red. Is there anything that my team is doing because I'm downstream from you that's affecting your ability to make your numbers, right? Can you figure out a way that is there something connecting me to you in the organization that I might be able to do better that will help you and just kind of get that conversation going?
Yeah. I think that's important. To address it that way, that's also really good at bringing you and your team into it to see if you can support that person. It's almost like a call to arms. I love that. But it's also good. I liked how you brought up, even when it's just one-off things, maybe going up to that person and showing vulnerability. This is part of accepting responsibility for things, right? And it shows your we don't even have a segment on vulnerability coming up, but I think that's also important because if you go up to a team member or not a team member, but a peer, right? Or even your boss sometimes, and just saying, hey, look, I'm struggling in this area. I noticed that you've had success here. What would you recommend? It could be your boss or your peer. That also it develops the trust that we're talking about, and it also shows that you're willing to accept responsibility, that you are not this perfect person. A lot of people at work, I think accepting responsibility is that vulnerability that says you're not perfect, you make mistakes, but you're willing to also receive feedback and correct those mistakes. Feedback is probably the most important thing in all of this. But that conversation that you have with your peers or your boss or whatever the case may be, that aside from your team, you should always accept responsibility for the sake of your team.
Yeah.
That's probably the most difficult things that managers struggle with, just because you try to be this strong, independent guy at the top that has all the answers. Well, you need to show vulnerability because your team needs to see that you don't have all the answers. But when you can do that with your peers and your seniors, well, now they're more likely to come to you as well when they have a struggle, not just you seeking out, you trying to go over and solve everybody else's problems. That's a scenario in itself, just like we got done talking about. But if you show that vulnerability up front, it doesn't show that you're incompetent. So many people think that it shows that you're incompetent. And, competent leaders rely on they use all of their resources, and your boss, your peers, your team, all of those people are resources. When you lose sight of that, your leadership viability score drops way down. So
That's right.
I'll always keep that in mind. Don't be this guy who thinks he has to be on an island by himself solving all of the world's problems. That's not how leadership works. And accepting responsibility, part of that is showing the vulnerability to express that you don't have the ability to do that all the time. So that's not exactly the same vein that you were in, but you did talk about, going over to your peer and just having those conversations. I think this is another important conversation that you have to have on a regular basis instead of trying to do everything by yourself.
Yeah. And that this was not planned, but our next episode in this series is about EQ and relationship building.
There you go.
So I'm so like dialed in on this conversation right now. I almost want to just do episode 2. But
Me too.
I think that that's going to be a great conversation because we're going to dive into these things, right? Vulnerability, big piece of building relationships. And it takes emotional intelligence to be able to determine when to be vulnerable and when not to be vulnerable. So, dude, I'm really looking forward to our next episode now. Like, this was a great lead-in.
It was. But and we'll go over into this, but there are 4 pillars of emotional intelligence that we're going to talk about that affect every interaction that you have at work. And not just at work. This leadership is life, people. So, this is all stuff that you can apply outside of your workplace. If you're a business owner trying to do business with other people and the whole 9 yards. So please tune in. I see we have a couple viewers here right now. Please interact. We love the interaction. But before I do my little final spiel here, Chris, do you have anything you want to add to anything that we've said to this conversation? I know I always ask that at the end.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, be comfortable knowing that the buck stops with you, but don't confuse it with you having to shoulder the entire burden. That other people who may be responsible need to know about it, but you as a leader, ultimately, it's your responsibility to take it and kind of figure out solutions going forward.
You're right about that. And, that's all about that initial phrase that was brought up at the very beginning, accepting responsibility for everything within your sphere of influence. If somebody comes up to you and says that there's a problem with you or your team, don't pass the buck directly to the end user. Accept responsibility, figure out how you're going to fix it, and move on. Taking the blame doesn't mean that people are actually looking at you as the person who caused the problem, but it shows them that you are a problem solver. So that just adds to what Chris was saying, because be that problem solver, use your resources. Every person on your team and in your organization can be a resource. And we're going to talk about building those responsibilities next time. So, yeah, we're wrapping this up. Thank you again for coming on our journey on Leadership Live and joining us all the time. Please like these videos wherever you see them. Subscribe if you're on my YouTube channel. But the most important thing always, this is actionable leadership advice for day-to-day work and life. So make sure you're commenting either during or after the live to make sure that we are talking about the things that you want to talk about, not just talking about the things that we want to talk about. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and we will see you in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, everybody.